About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research and explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items, and I'll answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org, Noetic moments. Well, as most of you know, consciousness is considered being aware and awake in normal medicine and psychology, knowing what's going on around us. But in the field of noetics, we think of consciousness as very much more. Ultimately, it's the process and products of mind both in our awareness and outside of our awareness, and it's the processes and products of mind that may be interconnecting everything in the universe. Consciousness connects us all. Now, as we've explored these ideas over the last several months, we started with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's ideas from the early 20th century, 100 years ago, explaining how much of what goes on in the mind is not in our normal awareness. It is, in fact, unconscious. We looked a little bit at Jung's ideas of archetypes and the field of the collective unconscious. Then, bouncing over the 30s, 40s, and 50s, when those ideas were being applied, we went to Charles Tart's 1960s descriptions of the various states of consciousness we might be in, and Julian Jaynes relating consciousness to the separation of right and left hemispheres of our brain, which each function in very different ways. We then looked at some of the field models of mind that were developed by Kurt Lewin, Rupert Sheldrake, and others, trying to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by the body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel, which of course brought up how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness as described in the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami. We looked beyond that into the idea of a noosphere, or global brain, as described by Teilhard de Chardin, Peter Russell, and most recently by Ervin Laszlo. And then the field of transpersonal psychology, which applies these understandings in therapy and in research. We then looked at the work of biologists Bruce Lipton and Candace Pert, who described how hormones act as molecules of emotion in various parts of the body, leading ultimately to a biology that is based on the belief systems that generate those hormones. And that led to what is increasingly understood as a state of coherence, in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions, those molecules, are all in alignment. We explored then some of the experimental results that support these new ideas about consciousness, experiments demonstrating telepathic communication between two people, the ways that mind affects matter, and the experience of remote viewing or clairvoyance. Then we talked about the different states of consciousness we operate in every day. We explored frequencies and how we can move into higher and lower frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and the heart using the works of Penny Pierce, the study of cymatics, the HeartMath Institute, and the water crystal experiments of Masaru Emoto, and more. For several episodes, we looked at the healing process and the role that consciousness and energy flows play in the body's response to threats and distress. And then we looked at the structure and function of the brain, which is the bridge between mind and body. Though materialist and physicalist scientists think the brain is the origin of our consciousness. Well, that then led us to explore how the mind, if it's not a function of the brain, actually may continue. And we have experimental results that demonstrate they continue even though the brain may not be functioning at all. To explain that, how mind can exist whether the body is there or not, we looked again at Ervin Laszlo's global mind, in which he calls the Akash, or Akashic record, and also at a physicist's remarkable discovery that the equations that describe a neural network for machine learning as a system can demonstrate as well the behaviors of quantum reality as well as classical reality, suggesting, he says, that the underlying structure of the universe is in fact a microscopic neural net. With all of this in mind, we returned last week to how bodies can heal simply by a shift in the consciousness of the individual, through their own beliefs and actions, and through their reliance and trust on others. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. Click on that little cloud up in the banner at the top of the screen, and on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you will find links to all of the books, the videos, and the authors that I mention. Now, if you've been following this show at all or listened to this intro that I just went through, you can see that we are reaching the point where we can no longer accept that what most of us were taught in school on the subject of consciousness has anything to do with reality. Sigh. So what I thought I'd do today is a bit of a review to provide some other insights and angles and understandings about that. Let's start with that biologist from Cambridge, Rupert Sheldrake, who has demonstrated through dozens of experiments and thousands of natural examples that every mind has access to information by means that are outside our normal senses. And he's developed a powerful field model in which groups and individuals form different forms and modes of consciousness. Here is Rupert Sheldrake on materialism and consciousness.
Speaking as an old brain scientist, most neurophysiologists, neuroscientists are materialists. They believe that what we perceive to be consciousness is purely the product of the human brain. What is your view on the nature of consciousness? Is it something fundamental in the universe? Is it something fundamental to human beings? Or is it purely something that is derived from the physical world?
Well, if you're a thoroughgoing materialist, I'm not a materialist, but if you are, and you say that the material stuff or the material activity of the brain can be conscious, you've still got to explain how matter can be conscious. There are some materialist philosophers, particularly Galen Strawson, he's a British philosopher, who's recently come out as a materialist saying materialism implies panpsychism, because if matter can be conscious in the brain, unless consciousness mysteriously appears from nowhere in human brains or somewhere else, all matter has the potential for consciousness. So he would argue a thoroughgoing materialism would imply consciousness throughout all nature. And why not? I think he makes a very good case for it. And I think that the conventional view that the whole of nature is totally unconscious, that somehow when brains reach a certain size, a kind of light bulb of consciousness goes on, and it doesn't do anything anyway, even when it's gone on. I personally find that a fantastical point of view, very unconvincing, and even materialists don't seem to believe it very thoroughly once they leave their laboratories. It's very difficult to lead life as a thoroughgoing materialist. That you are nothing but the activity of your brain, and that's all caused by physical causes. You don't really have any free will, just an illusion of it. Our whole legal system is based on the assumption people do have free will. I think it's a bizarre philosophy, and although it's common within neurophysiology labs, It's very hard to defend in philosophical terms, in my opinion.
So what then is consciousness, based on your understanding of the nature of reality and how reality is structured?
I think we have to ask, what does consciousness do? And I think consciousness is involved in choice and the weighing up of possibilities. Consciousness inhabits the realm of possibility. It's different from actuality. And what consciousness does is enables different possibilities to be held together and chosen among. Now, I think to any system in nature which has possibilities which are not fixed, would have some measure of consciousness. And what quantum physics tells us is that every system in nature is not rigidly determinate. It has possibilities. Even a hydrogen atom, an electron, has a whole realm of possibility open to it, of which only a small fraction is realized. Now, to what extent it's making real choices, to what extent there's consciousness in something as simple as an electron, is arguable and probably undecidable. I think it gets much more interesting when we look at larger systems like the sun or the galaxy. If consciousness emerges from patterns of electrical activity in your brain and mine, as most materialists would assume, the sun has vastly more complex patterns of electrical activity than our brains. So why shouldn't that be associated with consciousness? Why shouldn't the sun have a mind? And if the sun has a mind, why not all the stars? If all the stars have minds, what about a huge collection of stars like the galaxy, linked up by vast plasma currents of electricity surging through the arms of galaxies, linking together all the parts of it?
So you're building a hierarchy of different kinds of consciousness, each one truly conscious, not metaphor, but real?
Real, but with its own kind of consciousness. Human consciousness is different from dog consciousness.
That was from a video series called Closer to Truth. It's a channel on YouTube, and I often draw on material from that series, and the voice who was doing the interview was the man who manages Closer to Truth on YouTube. So that particular interview, I think, is perhaps the clearest of Sheldrake's explanations of his understanding of consciousness and his recognizing what more and more scientists who step outside, as he said, out of the laboratory, begin to acknowledge that if what is going on in the brain generates consciousness, then what is going on that is like it anywhere must be generating some form of consciousness, and the possibility of multiple forms of consciousness makes the whole universe a different kind of structure. This idea that every level of being in the universe has the opportunity to choose and therefore may be exhibiting some form of consciousness conforms to what Dana Zohar told us weeks ago when she was explaining how the fact that in the classic quantum experiment called the double slit experiment, the electron or the photon or the other particle that is being beamed toward a screen may choose to go through one or both slits and seems to be making a choice based on the presence of an observer. We either get an energy pattern or a matter pattern based on the presence of an observer. And if you'll recall, when we were talking about the work of Amit Goswami and his self-aware universe, he was telling us that if it requires an observer for energy to take on the form of matter, and there aren't any human beings present, that means that the universe itself is observing itself, which I think is fascinating because last week, when we were talking about the field of New Thought, which is a group of thinkers and have become churches, but they're primarily schools in which people are trained how to support each other in healing processes, one of the founders, Thomas Troward, was very clear that the universe is the result of the self-contemplation of the source consciousness that is underlying all matter, energy, all form, and us. He calls what we might call God, or what could be called the source of all that is, what he calls universal spirit, he also calls the creative process. This process of choosing and creating that Sheldrake suggests may be what consciousness is and may be findable at many, many levels of being, all the way from the subatomic particles through to galaxies and perhaps beyond. Imagine, if you will, as many, many, many people have done in the previous several 100,000 years, that which we call the sun is in fact a form of consciousness that we cannot even begin to fathom. And as Sheldrake pointed out, if consciousness is a function of the complexity of the number of electrical interactions, which is what a lot of people in artificial intelligence and neurology are suggesting, well, the sun's got a lot more than we do. So that would be a fascinating realm to explore. And, of course, in myth and legend and in meditation, it has come out as very likely that there is some form of consciousness that is so far beyond us in the sun, and perhaps even as this planet, which is a very complex system of interactions, and that's so far beyond us. It is, as at least one marvelous philosopher used to say, it's as if we were human beings trying to connect with cockroaches, right? The sun trying to make itself aware to us. How would we make a cockroach aware of our conscious being? Unless you're a fan of Archie and Mehitabel, which is a story based on that very thing. All right, so we've been looking at this idea that consciousness is everywhere present, in all forms, in different forms. And that's the piece that Sheldrake contributes that is so useful. He called it the theory of morphic resonance back in the 80s. And he was trying to help us understand that as different groups resonate together, they form a field of commonality. And the commonality comes out as consciousness. And he points out different species have different fields of resonance. He also points out that a group of people or a group of different species in an ecosystem, for example, may also form a resonant field in which there is a shared awareness, a shared capacity for choosing and letting each other know about it. A school of fish, a flock of birds flying, an individual within a flock being pulled back into the flock without anyone saying a word. I love to watch the pelicans as they glide along the surf lines here on the Pacific coast because they generally work as a single unit almost, just flying as if they were a single unit. And every now and then one will break away and do something, and very soon is back in, he or she, back into the formation of the pelicans. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments on KXCR, which is 90.7 on the FM dial, and streaming on KXCR.net. And that sound tells me it's time to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, are curious about. Some weeks ago, I shared that one of our listeners was curious about what this word cybernetics that I use is, and I gave you a little bit of the history of it. And I'd like to go back again at this show to talk a little bit about how cybernetics is relevant to what I'm talking about with you all. How are consciousness and cybernetics connected? Well, as Norbert Wiener formed the term, he was looking at how a plant behaved in the same way as an informed aircraft gunner who had the necessary target information to change the direction of his gun to follow a plane. The plant follows the sun, the gunner follows the plane. That happens through a mechanism that has been called feedback. That is, information from the activity of the system is fed back to a director in the system. That director might be the human being, as in the case of the gunner and the gun. Or that director might be somewhere built into the organism. In human systems, we have a variety of systems going on, feedback loops going on, one that manages our respiration, one that manages our circulation, one that manages our body temperature, etc. So we have a number of feedback loops. We are, in fact, second-order cybernetic systems with multiple feedback loops, each focusing on and supporting their own system as affected by the other. Our brain is historically known as the controller of all those systems. We're finding out, though, that it's not so much so. It is, as we've been saying in the show, more of a receiver-transmitter. It gets the information and it sends it on. So if the heart is sending information to the brain about something, then the brain sends it on to other parts of the system through the nervous system. And the HeartMath Institute has discovered and generated data to support that the heart actually sends far more information to the brain than the brain does to the heart. If we understand, then, that the brain is a receiver and transmitter of information, then we can see that the control is somewhere else. And as I've been suggesting, the control then must not be the brain, must be somewhere else. And I have been suggesting that this thing called mind, which is not the brain, is where the control is. And if we look back at last week when we were talking about how it is that the belief and trust of the individual determines the likelihood of their healing, regardless of the form of curative mechanism being used, then we can see that that belief and trust is not located in the brain. It's located in the field of the mind, in the consciousness of the being, in the mind that surrounds us, supports us, sustains us, and with more and more evidence, is interpenetrating every cell of our body. There is a morphic field, a resonant field for all the cells of our body, which is the consciousness of this being. And those beliefs and those ideas held in that field are what are monitoring and adjusting the behavior of the body to experience. So if you hold an image of yourself in one form and you don't have any conflicting ideas about that image, then the systems of the body are going to be told by the brain, oh, this is the image we're working on, so behave this way, right? If the image or the belief system being held in mind is that change can't happen, then change won't happen. Or if the belief system held in the mind is, well, I'm a certain age now, therefore this must be happening to my body, guess what? That is what is happening to the body. So aging is literally a function of the mind. It's all in your head, my dear. No, it's not. It's in that field of mind that the brain in your head is receiving messages from and transmitting to the systems in the body and then acting as a cybernetic governor on those systems to keep them in alignment with that image. So, if you want to change your life experience, you have to change your mind, not just your thinking. Your mind. And your mind is the composition of all of those beliefs, those memories that you hold fondly or hold with anger, any kind of emotion at all, the ideals that you have held and compared yourself against. Your mind has all of that experience from birth and maybe from other lifetimes if you buy into that model. And that is where the change needs to occur. And that is why the particular methods that we pointed to a few times that Joe Dispenza uses can be so effective. That's where we are today. And I hope you have found this useful. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, We'll look at more of the research being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is and how we can experience life differently and more fully when we use the consciousness that is ours more fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of all the shows that we've done so far, up to the past few weeks, and other resources that we refer to on the show, the books, the videos, etc., where you can send me your comments and questions, and I'll do my best to get them answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.